So, I mean, why do you think this violence has been taking place in South Africa? And has it been dealt with the right way by the South African government, especially, as you mentioned, at a time of COVID lockdown restrictions?
I think this is a crisis that has hit a boiling point of 10 years or a decade of mismanagement. Firstly, if you recognize the ability of the state, if you reflect on South Africa, liberation movements tend to come on board, they capture the state, they fragment the state, and ultimately the very act of corruption arises when somebody personalizes or privatizes the use of the state. So if you follow that crisis, given the fact that South Africa's GDP has not grown, given the fact that South Africa has a very permanent history of violence and service delivery protests, coupled with the fact that the majority of young people cannot find work, the conditions in a COVID pandemic could not be more aligned, as it were. And therefore, what has started to happen is the fact that in the recent while, the state has been profoundly incapable for reasons I've already alluded to, but also for the fact that some of the people in the state security agency have been aligned to former President Jacob Zuma, rather than in fact being professional enough to defend the interests of the state. It's also been fragmented purely because the ANC, as it's a divided organization and a liberation movement that has mismanaged the economy, is failing to be able to get on top of the situation and give leadership to a generation of young people who have effectively nothing to lose. So on the first score, I really believe that the state has managed this poorly. Secondly, that it ultimately, the chronic conditions still exist. So therefore, anyone who feels the need to redo these actions will have some success. And ultimately, because of the financial conditions here in South Africa, you're seeing the fact that even the initial deployment of the troops was 2,500 soldiers in a condition that needed far more than that. That the police themselves had run out of basic tools to fight the crisis, running out of shields, running out of water cannons, no technology. This is an indicator of a state that hasn't got the resources to be able to protect itself against profound threat. But to me, over all of this, Charles, is actually a necessary condition for where ultimately there needs to be reform in South Africa. We cannot keep going the way we've been going and hope for different outcomes. So that's the moment South Africa finds itself in. And I think it's very important for the continent of Africa and most pertinently for the SADC region.
Well, we'll try and get into some of those things you mentioned there, but one presumes, Musi, that you support the government in its attempts to end this violence and unrest, even though you were leader of the opposition and are clearly not a member of the ANC.
Undeniably, obviously, like anybody else, I have made even the call to the presidency to say, before we only deploy the troops, South Africa is not a military state. We have to build a police rule of law that comes on board. And so I've recommended that we increase the number of police reservists that are on site so that there's 10,000 police that are available to be put back onto service, that the criminal justice system must hold. And I think one of the things that must be commended for the state in this regard is the fact that the constitutional supremacy of South Africa has held. In many countries, you know very well that leaders and former presidents don't simply get arrested, whereas South Africa has successfully managed to put a former president into prison. Whether you might have a view that's different to that, the fact of the matter is that he was asked to appear before a court, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to jail, which I think is important for the principle of the rule of law and constitutional supremacy. But furthermore, going on from this, given what needs to happen, I really do believe that once you've achieved both those things, an increase in policing, a new economic stimulus package that can ensure that micro-enterprise can be resuscitated, and a partnership with the region to ensure that outside actors don't bring influence, through the professionalization of the state security agency, I really believe that this could be a moment that sets South Africa up for its long-term future.
But, I mean, do you think there is the potential for this violence to continue for as long as Jacob Zuma remains in prison? Or has the country now exhausted itself in that regard?
I think first and foremost, I think that you will find that in the next couple of days it will subside, but that isn't a guarantee that it will not return. And I think the events have now in some ways surpassed President Zuma. Because if you are able to test the limits of the state, there's no deterrent to saying that you are willing to do that again or try it in a different format. They may not be to the widespread and that engages communities that they are, but one of the great risks that I'm sure President Ramaphosa must be deeply concerned about is the attack on strategic or national key points that take place in South Africa, whether those are airports, whether those are supply lines like the main highways that deliver food to communities. Those must be of real concern. So for us as a country now, we're dealing with the aftermath of the issue, where not only is there shops that have been closed down, but the supply of critical medicines, oxygen tanks, and actually a vaccination program in the midst of a pandemic. So I think the aftermath is going to be the hard work that will take central stage in the next number of weeks. But then ultimately the threat hasn't completely disappeared, given the fact that the instigators, as the president puts them, are not behind bars.
In terms of dealing with that threat, we understand that the party that you led, the Democratic Alliance, is filing criminal charges against Jacob Zuma's children, as well as the leader of the leftist economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema. Why is that, and do you support this? And we've got just about 40 seconds before we take a break.
Look, I think that anyone who encourages violence must have charges faced against them. I think that the DA is doing it to those narrow individuals is maybe political point scoring. But I do think that broadly speaking, as other players have done the same actions, same charges must be laid and arrests must be made of high profile people, including members of the ANC, i.e. Carl Niehaus and many others who have been in the ANC need to also face the same charges.
Mr. Maimane, please stay with us. We appreciate that you're a busy man, but would like a few more minutes of chat with you. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Musi Maimane, former leader of the opposition Democratic Alliance in South Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now let's continue our analysis of recent developments in South Africa with my first guest, the former leader of the opposition Democratic Alliance, Musi Maimane. Top of the list is, of course, the unrest which began last week following the jailing of the former President Jacob Zuma. His supporters took to the streets to protest, but those protests were soon followed by an outbreak of looting of shopping malls, with people carting away anything they could lay their hands on, and the pillaging concentrated mainly in the provinces of KwaZulu-Natal, where there's widespread support for Mr Zuma, and Gauteng. Mr Zuma's arrest was initially seen as a victory for his successor, Mr Ramaphosa, who has pledged to clean up South Africa's government and the ruling ANC. But the escalating unrest has also drawn attention to continued factional fighting within the former liberation movement, where Mr Zuma still commands support. And the former leader of the main opposition Democratic Alliance, Musi Maimane, is still with me from Cape Town. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Let's get away from the unrest a little bit and talk about your resignation in 2019 as leader of the Democratic Alliance, South Africa's main opposition party, according to many analysts, robbed the DA of a man, yourself, who was viewed as a potential sweep to power nationally?
Charles, not at all. I think that the tragedy about what has happened with the DA is that it's regressed the political infrastructure of South Africa to pre-1994 in the days of apartheid, of separation between black and white and political parties representing a race. And therefore, sadly, the DA now narrowly becomes a party that is exclusively for a particular race of South Africans. So does the EFF, so does the ANC. And then in the sprinkling of the rest of the opposition, you often find religious parties who are fragmenting. What South Africa desperately needs, and this is the project I'm engaged with now, is to say, how do we build that center ground of South Africans from a diversity of races, religious beliefs that are bound together by a set of values in order to challenge the change in South Africa, that are accountable to people on the ground so that the political project doesn't become elitist, but becomes one where people could actually hook onto it. And therefore, that project could not be successful within the DA, which is part of the reason I had to leave, and certainly is one that is missing in South Africa if you consider the fact that if you're an Afrikaans farmer and you're a young black youth, your life has not changed in the last 20 years, given the political infrastructure that we've got.
But it's interesting, though, isn't it, Musi, that while the DA was helped nationally by the spectacular failings of the ANC government under what many saw as the corrupt, incompetent leadership of Jacob Zuma at the time, and you, as leader, wisely positioned the DA as the anti-corruption party, and you earned an impressive reputation for that, you didn't seem to have the incentive to resolve deep rifts within the DA's own ranks, did you?
I think you need to recognize the fact that the project I was leading, often people mischaracterized it as these rifts that were occurring between progressives or not. What it was is that in a country that is fragmented, that has a history of racial divisions, trying to bring people together of different races within one party can, as many commentators describe it, that the hopes of one race can become the fears of another race. And I had the tough duty of trying to bring those together so that we could address the challenges of South Africa. And it is the South African problem, it is the African problem, and there are very few parties in the world that are seeking to achieve that. So now, ultimately, you realize that when other interests outside the organization are actually maintained, whether it's donors or any of that, are of a particular race and want to protect a status quo, you simply can't remain within that. And I really believe that given the new freedom that are found in building a grassroots movement, we are able to bring together people of different races for the future. And I'm confident that this will be the very thing that brings the change that we need in this country.
When you talk about the future, I mean, in your resignation speech of 2019, you described the DA as being the wrong vehicle for your vision of building a united South Africa. I mean, that prompted speculation that you and other people that left the DA may seek to form a new party. Is that what essentially this is about? Is that on the cards now?
Well, I think given the circumstances that have occurred, we have to build a grassroots movement and a coalition of South Africans, not just only politicians. I really believe the solutions of South Africa lie with business, civic society, and different role players. So if you look at the elections coming up now that are at local government, we've helped assist business community, residents association to stand for election where they can challenge and win and gain control of those councils and cities and towns. The next mission behind that is how do you reform the electoral law in South Africa so that direct elections can take place and members of parliament can be directly elected. The second thing is, how do we ensure that the presidential elections in South Africa can be direct elections? Because when you do that, then accountability is always to the people, and you can build a vehicle that can ensure that direct elections take place. So this is what this project is about, and it's bringing together different role players and new talent that isn't always in politics, but it's coming from different sectors in order to be able to stand for public office.
But I mean, there is appetite, is there, and space for a competent centrist party that can win black support, keep the government on its toes, and perhaps eventually push the ANC out of power.
It has to be built, and that's what this project is building towards, because ultimately it isn't just going to be a classic party, because not only is that centrist middle party needed, it also needs new faces. I think the South African political landscape, you talk about a former liberation movement, our cabinet is, at the risk of sounding ageist, is relatively old, but it's also old in its ideas and in its thinking. We need new, fresh, diverse views so that we can be able to position for the future on the environment, certainly on the economy, certainly on how people are held accountable, and also on our education front. So to achieve that type of reform, you need a different set of players and a different vision. And so this project is working towards that, in building that centrist vision with an economy that's inclusive and an education that empowers more people.
Well, I mean, I have to say that it sounds very similar to what you were saying in 2017 and earlier. The ANC, of course, eventually woke up at the time. They dumped Jacob Zuma. They brought in Cyril Ramaphosa, who appeared to be genuine in his commitment to tackle corruption and fix the economy. How much did that fracture the DA's support base during your last couple of years as a leader? Because the DA's share of the national vote dropped and triggered a vicious factional war inside the party that eventually forced you to resign. I wonder if you're treading the same path now.
No, I think that what has now become is that one of the great difficulties that the DA would always confront is that here was a white party seeking to attract black voters. We are wanting to build afresh with what, as the reflections of South Africa, a majority of black South Africans working with black and white people. So that's the first starting point to achieve a different outcome. Secondly, we are really engrossed in communities. And I think the DA missed a trick where it was ultimately this elitist organization.
Right.
Even towards the end, as I was working hard towards that, now we've got to get back to the ground. And I'm confident that as a diversity of people come on board, we can achieve the change we need.
Musi Maimane, I want to thank you very much. Absolutely delighted to have spoken to you there. Musi Maimane was the former leader of the Opposition Democratic Alliance in South Africa.